from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything, Chapter 34, Russia. All the further events during this last sojourn of mine on the surface of the planet Earth connected with the abnormal form of the usual being existence of those three-brained beings who please you, and at the same time many trifling incidents of all kinds which elucidated the characteristic details of their peculiar psyche, began from the following. Once, walking one morning by the said pyramids, a certain elderly being, a stranger, and in exterior appearance not a native, approached me, and, greeting me in the manner customary there, addressed me with the following words. "Doctor, you will perhaps do me the kindness to allow me to be your companion on your morning walks. I have noticed that you always walk in this neighborhood alone. I am also very fond of walking here of a morning, and as I, too, am quite alone here in Egypt, I venture to propose to you that I should accompany you on these walks of yours." Since the vibrations of his radiations in relation to mine appeared not acutely aut Kaluparnian, or as your favorites in such a case would say, since he appeared to be sympathetic, and furthermore because I myself had already thought of establishing here also corresponding mutual relations with someone, in order, as a rest from active mentation, to converse, sometimes by following only the course of freely flowing associations. I at once agreed to his proposition, and from that day forth began to spend the time of my morning strolls with him. During our further acquaintanceship, it transpired that this foreigner was a subject of that large community called Russia, and that among his compatriots he was an important power-possessing being. During these walks of ours together, it so happened that we began, why I don't know, to talk chiefly about the weak will of the three-brained beings, and about those weaknesses unworthy of them, which they themselves call vices, and to which they, particularly the contemporary beings, accustom themselves very quickly, and which finally become for them a basis in the sense of the aim of their existence, as well as in the sense of the quality of their being, manifestations. Once, during one of these conversations of ours, he, addressing me suddenly, said, "My dear doctor, in my native land during recent times the passion for alcohol is strongly developed and widely spread among people of all classes, which passion, as you know always, sooner or later, leads in general to those forms of mutual relationship which usually bring about the destruction of the century-old pillars and attainments of society. This is just why several far-sighted compatriots of mine, having at last understood all the seriousness of such a situation as had arisen in our country, collected together, in order perhaps to devise conjointly some means or other for the prevention of any catastrophic consequence. For the realization of this task of theirs, they there and then decided to found a society under the name of the Trusteeship of People's Temperance, and they chose me to be the head of this enterprise. At the present time, the activities of the trusteeship, as regards the organization of measures for the struggle against the said state evil, are in full swing. We have already done much, and we have in view to do much more." Having said this, he became a little thoughtful, and continued thus. "If now, my dear doctor, you were to ask my personal opinion as to the results expected from this trusteeship of ours, sincerely speaking, I should, although I am at the head of it, find it very difficult to say anything good about it. As regards the general position of affairs of this trusteeship of ours, I meanwhile personally place my hope only in a chance. In my opinion, the whole evil consists in this, that this trusteeship is under the protection of several groups, upon whom any realization of its task just depends. But as these groups each follow their own particular aims and wishes concerning each separate question, then over the solution of each separate question concerning the basic aim of the trusteeship, controversy always reigns. And thanks to this, day by day, instead of improving the conditions for a speedy possibility of a realization, indeed, of the aim which has been set as a basis for this very important actualization for my dear fatherland, there only increases among the separate members of our trusteeship all kinds of misunderstandings, personal considerations, gossip, intrigue, plots, and so forth, and so on. As regards myself, personally, I have during recent times so much thought, rethought, and consulted with various people who have more or less life experience, in order to find some way or other out of the situation which has turned out so sorrowfully that I reached such a state that I nearly fell ill and was compelled, by the insistence of those near to me, to undertake this journey here to Egypt, with the sole object of resting. But alas, now here in Egypt, even I have met with no success, because always those same black thoughts of mine give me no peace. Now, my dear doctor, that you already know approximately the gist of that affair, which was the cause for my present spiritual imbalance, I will frankly confess to you my inner thoughts and hopes which have arisen in connection with my acquaintanceship with you. The point is, he continued, that during our frequent and lengthy talks on the subject of the evil vices of people and about the possible measures for getting rid of them, I reached a full conviction of your thorough competency in questions of the subtle understanding of people's psyche, as well as in the creating of conditions for this struggle against their weaknesses. And that is why I regard you as the only man who might be the source of every kind of initiative for the organization, as well as for the carrying out in life of the activities of the trusteeship founded there at home for the struggle against alcoholism. Yesterday morning an idea came into my head over which I thought the whole day and evening, and it is about this that I finally decided to ask you. Would you consent to go to my country, to Russia, and after you have seen everything on the spot that is going on there, help us to organize this trusteeship of ours in such a way that it may indeed become of that use to my country for which it was founded? He further added, your just humaneness gives me courage to address this request to you, as well as the assurance that you will not, of course, refuse to take part in the work of saving perhaps millions of people. When this sympathetic elderly Russian finished speaking, I, having thought a little, replied that I might very possibly consent to his proposal to go to Russia, since that country might perhaps be very suitable also for my chief aim. Further, I said to him, at the present time I have but one aim, namely, specifically, to clear up for myself all the details of the manifestations of the human psyche, of individuals existing separately as well as in groups. Well, now, for the elucidation of the state and manifestations of the psyche of large groups, Russia would perhaps be very suitable for me, since, as I have understood during our talks, the disease of the passion for alcohol is spread there in your country among almost the entire population, thanks to which I shall the more often have the possibility of carrying out my experiments on various types, each separately as well as in mass. After this talk with the important Russian being, I soon got ready, and several days after left Egypt together with him. 2 weeks later, we were already in the chief place of existence of this large community in the town, at that time still called St. Petersburg. After we arrived there, my new acquaintance immediately gave himself up to his own affairs, which had very greatly accumulated during his long absence. By that time, among other things, there had already been finished there the construction of that large building which was destined by the trusteeship to this aim of struggling against alcoholism, and my new acquaintance immediately began to apply himself to the organization and preparation of all that was necessary for what they call there the inauguration of that building and the starting of the activities connected with it. I began, however, during that time to go about everywhere as is usual for me, and to frequent the beings of the city belonging to various what are called there classes, in order to become acquainted with the characteristic particularities of their manners and customs. Well, it was then that I constated, among other things, that in the presences of the beings belonging to just this contemporary community, there, as it is called, ego-individuality began during the recent centuries to form itself particularly sharply dual. After I had constated this and began specifically to investigate this question there, I finally elucidated that this dual individuality obtained in their common presences, chiefly owing to a non-correspondence between what is called the tempo of the place of their arising and existence and the form of their being mentation. In my opinion, my boy, you will very well understand this particularly sharp duality of the beings of this large community if I repeat to you word for word the opinion about them of our esteemed Mullah Nasser ad-Din, which he gave me personally. It is necessary for me to tell you that during the second half of this last sojourn of mine among your favorites, I happened more than once to meet that terrestrial, uniquely wise Mullah Nasser ad-Din, and to have personal exchange of opinion with him on various, as it is said there, life questions. This personal meeting of mine with him, in the course of which he, with a wise saying of his, defined the real essence of the beings of that large community there, took place on one of the parts of the surface of your planet called Persia, in a locality named Ispahan, where I happened to be for my investigations concerning the most saintly activities of Ashiar Shiamash, and also for clearing up on the spot that question I needed of just how there arose, for the first time, the form of their so-called politeness, now everywhere existing there, and also maleficent for them. Even before my arrival in Ispahan, I already knew that the esteemed Mullah Nasser ad-Din had left for the town Talai Nikkum to stay with the stepson of the eldest daughter of his godfather. After I had arrived in this latter town, I immediately sought him out, and the whole time I was there often visited him, and sitting on the roof, as was the custom in this country, we would chat together about every kind of what are called there subtle philosophic questions. Once, on the second or third day, apparently after my arrival there, on going to him in the morning, my eye was struck by an unusual movement in the streets. Everywhere there were being cleaned, swept, and hung out what are called carpets, shawls, flags, and so on. I thought, evidently one of the two celebrated annual festivals of the beings of this community is beginning. On ascending to the roof, and having exchanged the usual greetings with our dear, most eminent and wise Mullah Nasser ad-Din, I asked, pointing with my hand to what was happening in the street, what it was all about. Over his face spread his customary benevolent and, as always, enchanting grimace, which nevertheless had a slight shade of contempt, and he intended to say something. But at that moment there resounded in the street below the shouts of the town criers and the clattering of many horses. Then our wise mullah, without uttering a word, got up heavily, and having taken me by the sleeve, led me to the edge of the roof, and then, winking cunningly at me with his left eye, he turned my attention to a big cavalcade, which was rapidly galloping past, and which consisted, as I later found out, chiefly of beings who are called Cossacks, belonging to that same large community there, Russia. In the center of this large cavalcade there rolled by what is called a Russian phaeton, harnessed with 4 horses, driven by an unusually fat and imposing-looking coachman. This imposing exterior, also quite Russian in manner, was due to the pads put in corresponding parts under his clothes. In this phaeton sat 2 beings, one of the type of that country, Persia, and the other a typical what is called Russian general. When this said cavalcade had moved off a long way, Mullah, first of all uttering his favorite saying, "So and so must be, do not do what must not be," and having also uttered his favorite exclamation, somewhat resembling "Zert," he returned to his place and suggested to me that I should do the same. Then, having arranged the still smoldering charcoal on his kalian, he sighed deeply and pronounced the following tirade, which, as always, was not immediately understandable. Just now, in the company of a large number of well-bred turkeys, a crow of this country passed by, who, although one of the chiefs and of high rank, was yet nevertheless rumpled and badly molting. During recent times, I don't know why, high-ranking crows of this country no longer, in general, take a single step without these well-bred turkeys. They evidently do this in the hope that maybe, perhaps, the pitiable remains of the feathers would, owing to their being constantly within the powerful radiations of these turkeys, become a little stronger and cease to fall out. Although I understood positively nothing about what he had just said, yet already knowing his habit of expressing himself, first of all allegorically, I was not at all surprised and did not question him, but patiently waited his further explanations. And indeed, then, after he had pronounced the tirade and had thoroughly finished hubble-bubbling the water in his kalian, he, while giving in his subsequent speech with the subtle venom which is proper to him, a definition of the whole presence and general essence of the beings of the contemporary community Persia, explained to me that he compared the beings of this same community Persia to the birds, crows, while the beings of the larger community Russia, who formed just that cortege which had galloped along the street, he compared to the birds, turkeys. He developed this thought of his in a long dissertation thus: if we analyze impartially and sum up statistically this understanding and picturing which obtain among people of the contemporary civilization concerning the races which populate Europe, in contradistinction to other continents, and make an analogy between these races and birds, then the people who represent the very tzimus of contemporary European civilization, namely, those who arise and dwell on the continent Europe, must infallibly be called peacocks, that is, the birds who have the most beautiful and most gorgeous exterior, while the people who dwell on other continents must be called crows, that is, the most good-for-nothing and dirty of all birds. But for those contemporary people who obtain the basis and the required conditions for their arising on the continent of Europe, and who are formed on it, but whose subsequent life and consequently further stuffing proceeds for some reason or other on other continents, and also for those contemporary people who, on the contrary, appear on God's earth on any continent and obtain their further stuffing under the conditions arising and reigning on the continent Europe, no better comparison can be found than the bird turkey. This latter bird, more than all other birds, expresses a something which is neither fish, flesh, fowl, nor good red herring, but which represents in itself, as is said, a half with a quarter plus 3/4. The best representatives of these turkeys are the contemporary people of Russia, and it was by these turkeys, namely, that one of the chief crows of this country was surrounded, who not long ago rapidly passed by us. These Russians, moreover, correspond ideally to this peculiar bird turkey, as the following considerations of mine show. Arising and being formed on the continent Asia, but chiefly owing to a clean heredity, organic as well as psychic, forged in the course of many centuries in conditions of existence obtained on the said continent, they become in all respects the possessors of the nature of Asiatic people, and consequently they should also at the present time be crows. But in view of the fact that in recent times they have all been striving hard to become Europeans, and have with intent been thoroughly stuffing themselves accordingly, they thereby, little by little, are ceasing to be crows. And as, according to several undoubtedly lawful data, they cannot turn into real peacocks, they, leaving the crows behind and not yet reaching to the peacocks, are in themselves, as I have said, ideally turkeys. although the turkey is a very useful bird for the household, because its meat, if of course the turkey is killed in that special way which people of old nations have there learned, thanks to long centuries of practice, is better and more tasty than that of all other birds. Yet in its living state the turkey is a very strange bird, and has a certain very special psyche, to understand which, even though only approximately, is, especially for our people with their half-passive minds, quite impossible. One of the many specific features of the psyche of this strange bird is that the turkey, why I don't know, considers it always necessary to swagger, and thus will often, for no reason whatever, puff himself out. Even when nobody is looking at him, he swaggers and puffs himself out, though he does so, in this case, exclusively because of his own imagination and silly dreams. Having said this, Mullah Nasser ad-Din got up slowly and heavily, and again pronouncing his favorite saying, "So-and-so, this must be it," but this time with the ending, "Don't sit long where you shouldn't sit," took me by the arm, and together we descended from the roof. Here, my boy, while giving the subtlety of the psychological analysis of our most wise Mullah Nasser ad-Din its due, justice demands that it should be said that if these Russians have become such exemplary turkeys, we have in this case to blame it only once more onto those beings of the community of Germany. The beings of Germany were in this case guilty, owing to the fact that when they invented their famous aniline dyes, they overlooked one of the specific peculiarities of these dyes. The point is that with the help of those dyes, it is possible to dye all natural colors, except one only, namely genuine natural black, any other color. And it is thanks to this lack of foresight in these German beings that the scandalous misfortune for the poor Russians came about. That is to say, it is owing to the fact that the feathers of the crows are dyed by nature, as it unsuspectingly and unexpectedly turned out, just a genuine black, which, even with these aniline dyes invented by themselves, cannot possibly be dyed any other color, owing to the said vile imperfection of these dyes. That these poor Russian crows cannot therefore possibly become peacocks. And what is worst of all, having ceased to be crows, and not yet having become peacocks, they willy-nilly turn into the bird turkey, which expresses ideally, as has been formulated by our dear teacher, 1/2 plus 3/4. Well, thanks to the wise definition of the esteemed Mullah Nasser ad-Din, which he told me himself, I clearly understood for the first time why all the beings of that large community there, when they reach responsible age, become possessors of so sharply dual an individuality. But enough about this. Listen further now to the events in which I happened to take part after my arrival in the chief place of existence of the community Russia, then called St. Petersburg.